Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to another live event here in the member community. I'm going to, as usual, I've come on a couple of minutes early so that we can make sure that everything's working okay. But we'll really get underway here in a couple of minutes at the top of the hour. I am going to send a direct link to our guest for this evening, Chris Carberry, who might be finding his way in anyway, since he is a proud card-carrying member of this community that is for all of you. And if you are not a member of the Planetary Society and are not watching us live, well, of course, first of all, I invite you to become a member of the Planetary Society by visiting us at planetary.org and find out about all the benefits of being a member of the world's largest member-supported space advocacy group, one of them being this member community, this digital member community. I'm Mat Kaplan, the Senior Communications Advisor for the Planetary Society. Very happy to be joining you once again here in the member community. Some of you may remember me as the founder, the creator, and host for 20 years of Planetary Radio, now hosted by my able colleague, Sarah Al-Ahmed. And I'm going to start scanning the list here to see if Chris has come in. Ah, there he is. Chris, I'm going to promote you right now to speaker status so that we can get underway since we are moments away from the top of the hour. I want to let everybody know that, unfortunately, Amber, the great Amber Trujillo, is not able to be with us tonight to support us. Because she's on assignment. She's actually attending a conference for the Planetary Society. So we're on our own. And there's Chris. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Matt. How are you?
I'm great. It's good to see you. Always.
Good to see you as well.
And good to hear you, even though we won't hear any of the music that we'll be talking about tonight, at least.
We can hum along with it.
I actually plan to do that a little bit in a couple of cases. So I just want to finish letting everybody know, as you join us, and thank you for dropping in. We have now hit the top of the hour. If you've just joined us, I'm Mat Kaplan, Senior Communications Advisor for the Society, and the other fellow that you see there is Chris Carberry, the founder and CEO of Explore Mars, the wonderful sister nonprofit organization that puts on the Humans to Mars Summit every year in Washington, D.C., which I have attended for I forget how many years, actually. I don't think we could come up with it last time, Chris. How many years I've hosted?
Yeah, I can't recall. You know, same thing as we discussed before. We can't remember, but sometime in the mid-teens or a little, 2016, 17 or something like that. Then, of course, we had the COVID years, but
it's been great. It's been a wonderful relationship. And I am personally very proud to have won the little award, the Mars Horizon Award, which you see over my shoulder right there, a little bit fuzzed out by my camera.
Yeah.
But there it is, Chris. I'm very proud. It's a beautiful trophy. And in your honor, Chris, of course, I had to wear one of my Mars ties. So there's,
Very good.
There's Marvin, who has a nice soundtrack if you will watch the Warner Brothers cartoons, which I don't think made it into the movie, but then Marvin...
It did not. I couldn't fit everything.
Marvin's a bit player anyway, so I hope he doesn't disintegrate me for saying that. Chris, though, tireless advocate for human exploration of Mars, the author previously of Alcohol in Space, which is a book that I highly recommend. It's great fun about the history of spirits on orbit. And now this book, which I've discovered if I hold it right in front of my face, it won't automatically be blurred out by the camera. The Music of Space, Scoring the Cosmos in Film and Television by Chris Carberry, with a foreword by somebody who we will probably talk about later this evening, because she's one of the few women who has been a composer of music for space television, space movies, right? Do you want to say something about her up front?
Yeah, Nami Melamed is first female composer of a Star Trek series. So, you know, it's Strange New World. She also did the animated one, which is now
Prodigy.
Prodigy. I just kind of blanked there as well. So really talented composer, and she's done a number of other things as well.
Could have also been Below Decks, the other animated show, which I also think didn't.
No, you had it
make
right.
into
That was Prodigy. I just completely blanked on it.
Yeah, I remember reading about that and that they were very happy with her work. I was just starting to tell folks that because Amber can't be with us tonight, she's actually in Dallas, Texas. So you Texans might keep an eye out for her. She's attending a conference with another of our colleagues, and so she's unable to support us tonight. So if you are in the chat, and I'm looking at the chat now and seeing all of the praise for the book and all the welcomes from everybody who has joined us live so far. Please, if you hear something and you want to post something about it, I will be trying to keep track of this, looking for questions and comments coming from you folks that I can throw Chris's way. But also, you know, Amber does that great job of putting links up that are relevant to whatever we happen to be talking about at the moment. Any of you are also welcome to do that. I invite you to do that to serve the rest of the group that is with us live. I was also starting to say a couple of minutes ago, if you are not watching this live, if you are catching the recording, which maybe you found at planetary.org, should be up there within a couple of days. We are speaking, of course, on Monday, September 2nd, live. Or if you go to the Planetary Society's YouTube channel, which is now well above 100,000 subscribers, you will find this video there and be able to enjoy it. You just won't see the chat or be able to throw any questions at Chris. Okay, let's really get this going. I just have to wonder, Chris, if you aren't maybe an even bigger fan of movie and television soundtracks than I am. One of my favorite albums, which I don't think any other DJs at my college radio station used to play, was 50 years of film music from Warner Brothers, which I still love that. I love the work of the
also
great
a lot of
composer.
Eric Wolfgang Korngold in that.
You bet, yes, and Steiner and Newman. And also the work of the people who followed them, the people like Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, who are very well represented in your book. Did this have a lot to do with why you chose to write this book and chose this topic?
It is. I've always loved film scores, loved composers, and it was also a great excuse to be able to connect to interests. A good excuse to be able to, do something related to space and film and television music and meet some of my favorite composers, mostly on the phone and Zoom. But so I love when I can connect the different elements, my different interests into a single project. But I've always been a fan of film scores and their impact on the overall, effectiveness of a film or a television show, or seeing one that is poorly done, because not all shows have particularly good film scores.
Yeah. But the ones that do, I mean, it's amazing. And I think this is one of your lines from the book, but it's something I totally believe, that a film that might otherwise have been mediocre can be made much better by a great score.
Yeah, I'm going to jump away from a space film right now, but another John Williams score. Think of Jaws without the music. There are scenes where you see the barrels going through the water. Well, without the music, you're just watching a bunch of barrels go through the water thinking, what is this? There's no tension at all. It's just it's a boring scene. The music is, fills in for the shark.
Absolutely.
Same thing with a lot of other film scores. As I mentioned, probably talk about this later. In many ways, like, for instance, in Star Trek, the motion picture, the film kind of saved the film. They weren't finished with the special effects. There were a lot of elements that weren't done, so they really leaned on Jerry Goldsmith, leaned on his score. So that score really saved that film.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm one of those who enjoyed that film. I know it wasn't a big hit. Certainly not as big as Wrath of Khan, the one that followed it. And you trace almost the entire history of Star Trek through its music in this book, which, as a certified Trekkie, I was very, very happy to see.
Well, one of the reasons for it, I would have anyway, but the Star Trek franchise really were cooperative. I mean, I interviewed between composers, directors, producers, and actors. I must have interviewed 13 or 14 people from the Star Trek franchise, particularly the Next Generation, but before and after that as well. And so I was, because there was so much enthusiastic participation, interviews, I touched on it a lot, particularly in the Next Generation series, the one in those series of programs, starting with Next Generation. I had interviewed so many people, and so it is a little bit longer than other sections dedicated to television shows, because I had such buy-in from all these wonderful composers and directors and actors.
Certainly okay with me. Like I said, Trekkie certified.
Of course, including one of the big Planetary Society Star Trek actors, Robert Picardo, who it was a wonderful interview.
One of our board members who is right now in Canada, where they're shooting the next Star Trek series, Starfleet Academy. It's targeted at kids, and there's some other great people that are going to be in that show. I think I can talk about this, but that's where Bob's going to be staying busy for the next few months. I already see lots of great stuff people come in. Did I not say Lower Decks? I don't know what maybe I said, but it's, that fun other animated Star Trek series, which I thought I would probably hate, but it's so funny and it has so many inside jokes. Albert Hagee, one of our regulars, said, have you ever heard of the YouTube channel Melody Sheep? Not only have I heard of it, but we've actually worked with Melody Sheep, that channel, Albert, and that probably is a topic for another time. And we've even got some composers out there. Kareem said, John Williams is why I became a composer. And Tim said, and Goldsmith definitely rose to the occasion in Star Trek, even though, like Matt, I also enjoyed the first Star Trek film more than many. We'll keep trying to go back to this. Like I said, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as we continue our conversation with Chris. But Chris, I want to go back to the very beginning. And, you talk about the Lumiere brothers, who discovered that music was a good way to cover up the sound with a loud projector. But then the great George Méliès, who did, what was it called? A Trip to the Moon in 1902.
To the Moon, to not go into the French, the actual title in French. I always try to avoid that in interviews as well, because I'll just butcher it.
Yeah, me too. Was that the first film to have a dedicated soundtrack? Even though
it did not have a dedicated soundtrack, but it had a score was written presumably for it, but it wasn't an official score. Sometime within a year after, a British composer named Ezra Reed wrote a score that was supposed to be a companion to the film. And so, but it's still a little unclear if he had any connection with the filmmakers at all, or if he decided to do this on his own, because this was only discovered at, I believe, where was it, in the British Library, within the last couple of decades.
Yeah. I also, there were a lot of revelations for me in the book about specific films, TV shows, most of which I've enjoyed over the years. But there was something else about the origin of film music that I hadn't stopped to think about, hadn't occurred to me, and that was how much film music, basically, the way for it was opened up by opera, and how the early composers looked to opera, which had themes for different characters and told a story, obviously, and that was, like I said, a revelation.
Oh yeah, late Romantic period opera, Wagner particularly, but not exclusively. Particularly Wagner's leitmotif, basically themes for characters or different elements, even like mystical forces, like the Force, can have a leitmotif. And so two of the most interesting composers to do this. One was for one film which I think everybody here will probably have heard of, is Metropolis. And another one was a couple of years before for probably the first space documentary, also a German film, which was called Our Heaven. Well, once again, translated into English, Our Heavenly Bodies. And that was composed by, had a dedicated score by Ignaz Wagholder. And, they went all out. This was a really high-end documentary, and they really wanted to make sure it had a solid film score to accompany it. And so as people are seeing what the current state of the art of what everybody knew about space, the current physics, current knowledge of the solar system at the time, it was accompanied by a dramatic score, dramatic, romantic, late romantic style score. And Ignaz Wagholder was also an opera composer. And he actually even helped found, what is now the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. He came to the United States for a while, then went back to do compose music, in Germany in the 1920s. But more famously, of course, is Metropolis, Fritz Lang's film, from 1927. And Gottfried Huppertz wrote this film score for that. And it's just filled with all these different themes, very, very, in that leitmotif, including using, a variation on the French national anthem to represent, the workers rising up. It had, a number of other well-known pieces and original pieces in it as well. And just complete full score. And when it premiered in Berlin in January 1927, it had a 66-piece orchestra in the theater. But that score disappeared for many years after. This came shortly before, of course, the Nazis took over, and then World War II. And people, unless you were going to see this production in one of those huge movie palaces that could actually afford an orchestra, very few people would have heard this. And so it's unclear whether anybody heard it in the United States, but it soon disappeared and only reappeared once again in the last couple of decades, like decade and a half or so. And, it's not the entire score, but it's pretty close.
Not a space movie, but a terrific science fiction film, especially considering when it was made. I'm going to jump forward not very many years to one of my favorite films. But first, there's just a quote, a paragraph from the book, which I'm going to read, because I just thought this was one of many striking lines in the book. And it's from right up front. Absolute silence may reign in the vacuum of space, but music is and will continue to be an essential ingredient in our understanding, appreciation, and awe of this final frontier. Whether composers are finding new ways of conveying our wonder and emotions in film and television, or if astronauts and future explorers are expressing their experiences through composition and performance, music is how humanity will fill the silence of space. Well done, Chris.
Oh, well, thank you. And we should remind people the final chapter of the book is actually music in real space. So I also interviewed lots of astronauts and other folks who have played a role in this. So it does play a role in this book. So
and we're going to come back to that, because that is hopefully how we'll also close this conversation, just as it was nearly the close of your book. That movie that I was talking about, truly one of my favorites since the very first time I saw it, 1936, Things to Come, with the full collaboration of none other than H.G. Wells, and ends with astronauts being shot to the moon, literally shot out of an electric cannon, I think they called it, something like that. I just love that film. I mean, it is a little bit dated in terms of its dialogue and approach, but it's a
Oh, it is, and you're right. H.G. Wells played a very strong role. Obviously, it was based on his book, but he played a very strong role in the film, kind of producing the film itself, selecting, the composer and trying to make sure, and was hoping that the music would have a much larger role in it than it actually did, because he had promised the composer that, of course, they would actually adjust the film to the music. Of course, he made that promise without asking the director. And so it ended up not being like that, really irritating. And then once again, I'm blocked, but namely, Sir Arthur.
It's all right. It's all in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book. I'm just blanking on the composers. He's a famous British composer. I'm just blanking on his name.
But I remember reading that he then took the full score that he wrote and turned it into a performance piece, which became very popular in concert halls.
Yes. Hold on right now. I'm just quickly trying to refresh my memory by looking at Arthur Bliss. Yes.
That's right. Bliss. Right.
I remembered Arthur, but I couldn't remember Arthur, which Arthur it was, but Arthur Bliss. Yeah, he did. But he, he was really irritated that they had to rework his score. They brought in a secondary composer to actually, basically like a film music editor would do right now, and adjust it and do a little bit of additional music to make sure it all worked within the film. And so, it frankly pretty standard practice these days. But Arthur Bliss was really not pleased.
Yeah, at least it had a life outside of the film. Things really blew up in the 1950s, didn't they? I mean, literally, in some cases, and in some of the movies. I told you a couple of days ago when we talked that it was because of the book that I finally watched the 1950 movie Destination Moon, which you can watch from a number of streaming services, folks. If you've never seen it, first of all, it has the wonderful artwork of Chesley Bonestell. That greatest and really maybe original of the great space artists. I thought it held up pretty well. And reading about the music made me want to see the film. That happened over and over as I was reading this book. It's like, oh my God, I have to see this again now so I can listen more carefully to the music. Yeah,
and it is a great film, and it's kind of the start right at the beginning of the 50s, and basically two schools of music were competing, although one took over, which I'll get to in a second. But that one, of course, Lee Stevens, one of the great composers of the 50s, wrote the music. He also wrote basically all those space films that George Pal did, so, When Worlds Collide and War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
And, but for that one, it was really interesting because, as you mentioned, it was kind of really interesting piece because it does stand up well and actually reflects on themes that are very current, private sector space flight. You rarely heard in films of that era, them talking about budget cuts and, Congress eliminating a program, and therefore, millionaires at the time came in to help out, create this program. But then he also Lee Stevens created probably the first music of a scene that was really trying, attempting to create realism in space when they're in space doing a spacewalk. It was a bit cheesy, it was poor effects compared to now, but this was one of the
75 years ago. What could they do? Yeah.
Yeah, no, but as I said, there was another school that developed, and it's kind of funny because it was because one of the great film composers, wrote a score which all the B movies copied, throughout the 50s, and that's for The Day the Earth Stood Still and Bernard Herrmann. Bernard Herrmann was,
so
certainly, one of the great film composers of history, and anybody who's watched an Alfred Hitchcock film or Citizen Kane, or many other things, would know Bernard Herrmann. And so, of course, The Day the Earth Stood Still, famous score using two theremins and this unusual mix of instruments. It was a truly wonderful score and very innovative. But, of course, then for the rest of the 50s, that kind of a cheesy theremin sound was constantly used for all these B films. So it got really old pretty quickly. And so, everybody got, once you got past the 50s and early 60s, people were really anxious to get away from that sort of sound. And unfortunately, it was inspired by a really good score and a brilliant composer.
I gotta say, another of my favorite science fiction movies of all time, definitely The Day the Earth Stood Still, but from later in the 1950s, Forbidden Planet. And there are only two things that I really, God, I wish were different in Forbidden Planet. One, the silly bits that they did for comic relief. But more than that, that theremin-based soundtrack, I'm sorry, but that one I've just always found a little bit repulsive. I can stand it because the movie is so damn good.
Well, it's not even necessarily based on theremin. Basically, this was an electronic score, the first all-electronic score by Lewis and B.B. Barron. And they weren't even real composers. They experimented with these electrical, devices that made sounds, and that would kind of die out, and they'd use that. And when asked, I forgot who, somebody asked them, can you, if they could manipulate it for a certain scene, or said, could you make this sound like, inspire fear? And she replied, I think that's the only emotion we can actually, inspire with these electrical circuits they were using to generate this sound. Because originally, there was going to be a standard composer for Forbidden Planet, but I won't go into the details on that. But that didn't work out, and the Barons had actually run into the famous producer at a party, and basically tried to convince them, to have them come by and show him, their recordings of what they've been able to do. And he's trying to get rid of them and said, all right, if you're ever in Hollywood, come by and visit me. Well, they basically packed up and moved to Hollywood and ended up at his door. And they were hired. They weren't even hired to be the composers. They were hired to provide extra additional sound effects. Just because of the way it worked out with the other composer, they ended up being the composers. Except they were not given credit for that originally. Yes. So they were, so it wasn't until years later that they were acknowledged as the actual composers of the music, because they didn't want to, in addition to the fact they didn't use any musicians on it, they didn't want to run into problems with the musicians unions and all of that they didn't actually use real musicians in this. So it was an interesting history, and it was very unusual. It's a very innovative score. I agree. I'm not actually a great fan of it, but it's not something I listen to, when I'm in my car or anything. But It was certainly an interesting innovation and certainly one of a kind.
And it must have seemed very futuristic. It is a great film. Folks, I hope you're making lists of those of you who haven't seen these films, because you can find them, and they really are worth seeing. There's so little that you missed. I'm thinking of some of my favorite soundtracks or shows from the 1960s. I'll date myself, that I just loved as a kid. I was almost shocked when you mentioned Space Angel, which was this very limited animation thing that was actually pretty well written. It used to run on the old Sheriff John show, which I watched faithfully as a toddler in Los Angeles. And they would run Space Angel. But on top of that, I mean, the Jetsons, I can hum you the theme. Da 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 da. It's still very popular. And some of that, I think it was called Super Marionation or Super Marionettes.
Yeah.
We know Thunderbirds, right? But before that, I was a fan of Fireball XL5, which was you write about, and had a much more traditional soundtrack, right?
Yeah, no, it did. It was kind of interesting, those, whole range of different animated series that came out in that time frame, and which direction they'd go with them. And, like with the Jetsons, it was basically, in the same... Basically, it was kind of thought about to be like the Flintstones in space, where they weren't really in space. In the future, they were kind of on Earth, but up and suspended, like in the clouds, and it was very spacey. And so it was interesting what they did, with all of them just trying to find their place, after this, this decade of more electronic, kind of goofy sounding theremin music, trying to find a new sound, which, I think really began to move, of course, with additional shows, two famous shows that came up, of course, Lost in Space, and then, of course, Star Trek.
I was shocked again when you revealed to me that Lost in Space, the theme was by none other than John Williams.
Yeah, Johnny Williams at that point.
Johnny.
He had to go, I had to go with Johnny because there was an actually fairly well-known British actor named John Williams, in the 50s, 40s and 50s. And so, you can't have two people with exactly the same name in show business. So John Williams went by Johnny Williams and, until the demise of the British actor, and all of a sudden Johnny became John. Johnny, you are a man. You're now John.
Yeah.
But
nice.
He wrote the theme, and it was a different way of doing composing. They wouldn't necessarily write for every episode. There would be picks from different composers. But John Williams was there at the beginning with actually two theme songs. There was initial one, and then there was the more famous da 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 one that came second. Yeah, but he really set the tone. It was more other composers that really took over after a while, but John Williams set the tone for the show, and it was kind of an early. He concedes that some of the things or just techniques that he eventually used with Star Wars got their beginnings with that show, just kind of getting him in that frame of mind.
We're going to get to Star Wars. Don't worry, anybody. But now that we are roughly halfway through our hour, and Chris, I hope if it's warranted, if we're getting the demand, there certainly is lots to talk about. I'm leaving out so much of the book and my questions. I hope you can stick around an extra 5-10 minutes.
I'm sure I can.
Good. So just checking things out here. Let's see. Jack said, Chris, what a great interview. I am dazzled. Tim, my eventual question for Chris when you see this, Matt. Hi, Tim. Chris did a wonderful job tracing the history of music in space-based television and film. You quoted a lot of others' opinions, but you mostly kept your own opinions out of it. I'd love to know your own personal opinion of some of the music that you mentioned got mixed or negative reviews, such as Christopher Frank's work on Babylon 5, or Toto's work on Dune, the original Dune film, which I also was a fan of. Yeah, so take it away.
Thank you very much. And I should just tell everybody, if you liked it, I hope you'll go on Amazon and write a review as well. I haven't had really time to push the book over the summer, so I'm now beginning again. So I want to start getting, making sure there are enough reviews online as I start pushing the book again. But yeah, no, I come from, my background prior to space was historical researcher. And so I come from that school. I was an trained historian and archivist, and was a research assistant for many people writing books on the Kennedys and other things. And so I can't come at this like an historical researcher. And so I try to keep my opinions to myself, or if I put them there, I try to back them up with, verify, quotes from other experts. But, I loved, with Babylon 5, I loved that show. I thought the score was very good. And I thought sometimes, because there was only a single composer, with Christopher Frank, sometimes it was, very similar. There's a sameness to it over time, but I liked it. I thought it was very effective, and it mostly recorded over in Germany at his studio there. And he was an early person and recording portions of an orchestra. So you could do this portion of it and then put them together. Well before the kind of the COVID times when everybody was forced to do that. So I thought it was highly effective, and that, but once again, the only thing I thought was, a flaw in it is that because it was a single composer, it sometimes each episode sometimes sounded alike, Whereas with like Star Trek, the Next Generation, which was around the same time period, they had multiple composers. Usually had, two or three, sometimes more. They'd bring other people in for specific episodes, but usually two or three composers all doing it, and all of them were kind of working to their max just to kind of fill all of those, write those scores. So I really have to hand it to Christopher Frank, though, because being a single composer writing the music for every episode was a Herculean task. So I can't really criticize too much that some of them sounded alike.
You made me think of Star Trek, the original series, Next Generation, musically far superior in most ways, but because I remember, and more recently watching original series episodes, you'd hear the same little dramatic stinger to take you into a commercial across the entire series, if I remember correctly. But it did have that great Alexander Courage theme up front, and those notes that stick with us that just say Star Trek. Da 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 da, and that is still Star Trek to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and Alexander Courage, or Sandy Courage, he went by. Really set the tone early on, but he didn't stick around because conflict with Gene Roddenberry. It's over that theme song. It's basically Alexander Courage wrote the theme, obviously, and Gene Roddenberry actually wrote lyrics for it. Anybody who watched the series saw, would say theme song by Alexander Courage and Gene Roddenberry. Well, Gene Roddenberry didn't have anything to do with the theme song itself. He wrote really awful, lyrics, which I originally had in the books, but the publisher wanted me to remove them because, let's just say, Paramount and Star Trek franchise tend to be a bit litigious, and so they like being very, very careful. And we're dealing with Star Trek, but it's these lyrics were pretty awful. They were never used, but frankly, it was given excuse so that Gene Roddenberry could get half the royalties for half the payment for the theme song. It was kind of, I would have been pretty irritated as well if I were Alexander Courage.
I have a Leonard Nimoy album, which I've owned for over 50 years, vinyl, of course, which actually has that song with the lyrics. And they're not great. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to keep moving on because, man, there is just so much more I want to talk to you about. Beginning with, and I'm kind of going through this chronologically if you haven't noticed already. When I turned 14, 1968, I told my parents, I don't need a party. Take me to see 2001: A Space Odyssey. And so they did in Cinerama. And I was blown away. And one of the things that blew me away was the music. Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz has continued to be one of my favorite classical pieces of all time. And then there was all that music from Ligeti. Was it György Ligeti, I think?
György Ligeti.
Ligeti, which was just, perfect for the times that it was used in the film. Although that was another one, right, where the composer got a little upset with Kubrick after the fact.
Yeah, well, because Kubrick didn't ask permission. Yeah, he used actually extensive amounts of his compositions in this, from 3 pieces without permission. And they worked very well. I mean, and really, these were long scenes. It would be hard to get away with how long these scenes were with this music. And Ligeti actually sued Kubrick, but only ended up with a tiny settlement, and so pretty much, I think at one point was saying, calling him various names, but eventually they worked together again. So, but this time, composer got well paid. But this was an interesting one, of course, because it was all pre-existing music.
Yeah,
it was unusual, and the studio really wanted them to use, an actual composer. I mean, have an original score. They also didn't want to make it look like they couldn't afford an actual full score. And Alex North was hired to write the score. And he spent, many months kind of working on this, actually recording the score for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Except, and there was a dispute between Alex North and Alex Kubrick, whether North knew in advance or not. But Alex North claimed that he had no knowledge that this score was not going to be used in the film when he went to see the premiere of it.
Oh, my.
Can you imagine if that was the case? Can you imagine being there
with your family there and
the music is being used? And so, regardless, I think Stanley Kubrick had always anticipated using these kind of classical pieces. He didn't actually particularly care for film composers. He thought none of them were as good as the great classical composers, and so. So this is how it came about. I think he did brilliantly, but there's still, for this particular film, but it isn't necessarily something that could have translated to many others. We've seen other films with well-known pieces, but if you're doing something, a different type of film, it doesn't necessarily work. And it's kind of funny because as George Lucas was putting together Star Wars, he was thinking about doing the same method as Kubrick had. He was thinking of using classical pieces as well as old Hollywood ones from like Erich Wolfgang Korngold, etc.
Wow.
But it was Steven Spielberg that convinced him to not use, that method. He said, there's this guy that I used on Jaws named John Williams. He's a great composer. He'd do a wonderful job on Star Wars, and that's the reason. And John Williams came in and explained why, an original score would do a much better job. And it's not just because he wanted the job, but he's correct that if you're using something like Holds the Planet, you have the music, and you cannot vary it. It's going to sound exactly the same at the beginning, in the middle, and the end. Whereas if, for instance, a composer writes an original score where they get inspiration from Holds the Planet or from Stravinsky or from Korngold, you can start off with that sound that people are familiar with and start doing variations and work it as the characters and the plot develops. And I agree with that. I mean, sometimes classical scores can work in the very specific circumstances, but a really good film composer, you can't compare with that because those are tailor-made. They're writing the music for that film, and it's going to be if you have a good composer, it's going to be difficult to have a better result.
It's impossible to think about Star Wars and not think of that music for me, and I suspect for a lot of other people out there as well. Isn't there a quote in the book from Johnny Williams, that he had no idea when he wrote the soundtrack for this little space opera of George Lucas's that it would become this gigantic multi-decade project?
Yeah, no, he did. No, nobody did, really. I know, obviously, George Lucas had kind of a grand vision, in mind, but nobody really thought that Star Wars would turn into what it did until, of course, the moment of the hit screens.
Yeah.
And, and that really, because the book is divided into pretty much before Star Wars and then Star Wars and after, because Star Wars, regardless if you're a Star Wars or Star Trek or some other franchise fan, there's no other film impacted space music, but frankly, film scoring.
All film music,
as much as Star Wars did, except maybe from the very early days. Like, I'd have to go back all the way to King Kong, Max Steiner's score, where he basically created that vocabulary, the techniques that people were still using, and he was using that kind of Wagnerian approach as well. And so, when Star Wars hit, it just transformed people's expectations, because for about a decade before this, orchestral scores had gone out of fashion. More folk music, popular music was being used, like in like Butch Cassidy and The Graduate and others. And people thought that, still nobody wants to hear an orchestral score anymore. They existed. There's some very good ones there, but it wasn't as popular as it had been. And then, that moment, in Star Wars, where everything changed. And of course, every space-related film after that for the next decade or two, where, most producers and directors wanted their composers to try to simulate that as much as they could. And of course, it also inspired interest in classical music in general. Like what John Williams created, he ended up, of course, he ended up being the conductor of the Boston Pops. But his music was actually the perfect Pops music, because Pops orchestras are supposed to be that kind of bring people in, introduce them to orchestral music with lighter stuff, and then kind of introduce them to more serious music, whatever that means. And so it was perfect at that. And it had so many elements of these great pieces of music, because that's how people accused him of plagiarizing early on. No, he was doing what the directors, producers, and great composers have done forever, particularly in film, because in most films, you'll have a temp track. And what a temp track is basically music which the director will put in, say, well, I want something that sounds like this. I want something that sounds like that. Well, I think you can, if you listen to Star Wars, you think, I bet the temp track had Host of Planets here. I bet the temp track had Stravinsky's Rite of Spring here. Because you can hear that. And I think he does a wonderful job at it. And, but once again, as I mentioned, he has those variations, starts off with that, and then moves it in an entirely different direction.
So then John Williams goes back to work for Steven Spielberg and helps to create a movie that is so closely tied to a musical theme. It's really at the core of the plot, and one that's a big one for us. And there it is, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Wait a minute, I got to get it right. Da, 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 da.
Very
and
good.
there's spectacular scenes like the one
You have a musical career ahead of you.
Thanks. Yeah, face for radio. It's just, that struck me so deeply when the movie was made, and I saw it the first time, and I was so overwhelmed that here was Spielberg and John Williams telling us, what if the aliens don't use language the way we do? What if they talk via musical notes?
Yeah, no, and they thought about this. They were thinking Spielberg didn't want to have them psychically talking to each other, because it had been used too much. He originally thought about math, but, that kind of it's not very cinematic. And so then finally came up with the music, which is highly mathematic. And, of course, brought in John Williams. And that theme took a lot of effort. They went through hundreds of different variations of 5 notes, trying to find the right one, kind of basically what Steven Spielberg called the doorbell, the hello, kind of welcome, I'm here, and, leading into the rest of the film. And so it was very effective, and it was great to hear, with that, using music as the universal language around the universe, which many different franchises have used to some extent or another since. I mean, not extensively, but Star Trek has done it. That was used. The music has been used like in the new battles. New meaning it's like over 20. It's 20 years old now, but the newer Battlestar Galactica. Also kind of used
the good one, the good Battlestar Galactica.
I like the music of the old one had a great theme.
The music was good.
It was a good theme. But regardless, it has been used also, and usually the composers reference, what John Williams did there. But that's, of course, that was just the most simple, I say. It took, John Williams used to say, sometimes those simple ones took the longest amount of time, because finding that short motif.
They nailed it.
Yeah, it's not easy. But then there was this just wonderful score, dissonance score, basically building a musical misdirect, because you don't know if these aliens are going to be nice by the end.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of dissonance. You have, and just, misdirecting you to think that, they have kind of evil in their hearts or something. And then at the end, of course, it goes from kind of that dissonant sound to a more traditional, bright, major key sound. And intermixed as, Richard Dreyfuss is going up in the spaceship, you even hear When You Wish Upon a Star, overlaying the music as well.
Just brilliant. I'd have been happy to spend the entire hour just talking about Close Encounters, but that movie is just so wonderful. And let's hope the aliens are that benevolent and can hold a tune as well as those could. By the way, Kareem, the composer out there, says, Matt, you have great pitch. Yeah, thanks, Kareem. Obviously missed my calling. A lot of other people who said they really hit the right note, if you will, with that 5-note theme that has stuck with me from Close Encounters. Another time that music played a really critical role in a show. You talked about how cooperative the people from Star Trek Next Generation were. I mean, you spent a lot of time, I think, talking to Jonathan Frakes, just a great guy. I'm thinking of an episode of Next Generation where I got to meet the screenwriter because he was a guest of yours at a recent Humans to Mars summit. It was The Inner Light, the one in which Captain Picard is somehow transported into the life of this man who lives on a doomed planet. Its star is getting old and is expanding. I bought a copy of the script at Humans to Mars from Morgan Gendel at the summit. And anybody who has seen that episode will remember that Captain Picard plays a flute. And at first he's given it and he doesn't know what to do with it. By the end, he's quite good at playing this little flute. And it becomes a treasured possession of Captain Picard when he returns to his own life, which just seemed like such a brilliant hook to me for that wonderful, lovely, and somewhat tragic story.
Oh, that's a great one. And Morgan's script, the one you have, is an earlier version, so a lot of differences from the actual final episode, but it's a great one. And of course, Jay Chataway, one of the wonderful composers in Next Generation, wrote that theme. He actually wrote 2 themes because they wanted, basically the producers wanted 2 just in case. So he had already written the famous one, then wrote a secondary one, which he didn't like as well. And he wanted to make sure it wasn't as nearly as good. So they picked the right one. But the second theme can be heard in that episode. Also, the Picard, what's the character's name that Picard, Galen or no?
Oh, I can't remember the guy he becomes.
He has a son who plays the flute, and you can hear it in the background. But it's also incorporated into the Picard theme many years later. And so, regardless, Jay Chataway, wrote that, and Patrick Stewart. Of course, the flute didn't play. So he had to pretend, that it playing it. And originally they were going to use more of a traditional flute, but they didn't want to block Patrick Stewart's face, so they used more of a penny whistle sort of, look and sound, of course. But eventually Patrick Stewart learned to play it on the penny whistle and actually played it a couple times in concerts. But that flute itself, the prop during a Star Trek auction, ended up going, I think it was estimated a few $100s, maybe a couple thousand, and ended up going, I forgot what the final cost, it's in the book, it's like $38,000 for basically a fake flute. I remember even looking at it myself, oh, it'd be cool to have Captain Picard's flute, and then it started going up in the tens of thousands of dollars. So
I got a story that I don't think I've told you, and I know I haven't told on air. I was at a Star Trek convention, and they had the preview of the Star Trek auction. And I was talking to Mike Okuda, who is other than Gene Roddenberry, is Mr. Star Trek. Mike Okuda and Denise Okuda and Rick Sternbach, who has a painting, a print I have of his work on the back there, who did such wonderful design work, basically created all of the look of and the technology of Star Trek Next Generation and several of the following series. I was talking to Mike, and I looked to my side, and there in a glass case is the flute. And I knew what it was immediately. I said, Mike, don't you think that should like go to Patrick Stewart? And Mike's response was, well, he's welcome to bid on it. Oh, well.
I remember seeing Patrick Stewart interviewed. I think they did a thing on the auction, and he started thinking. He looked at his old desk, in his ready room, and he started thinking, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice to have my old desk?" And I realized, well, that's stupid. It was a fake desk. I mean, it's
nice.
But in the nostalgia factor, he had spent so many years sitting in that chair at that desk, as a part of his life.
Yeah, very impressive. I just one more direct Star Trek mention, because I mentioned this to you a couple of days ago as well. I'm rewatching Star Trek Enterprise, which didn't go over that well. There were only, I think 4 seasons. And I actually am liking it much better. I'm almost through the first season now, and I'm enjoying it.
I like it.
Oh, and I liked it originally. Yeah, I was very disappointed when it got canceled because I thought it was really hitting its stride, which took Next Generation 2 or 3 years, and knew some of the people who were involved with it. But I'm liking it even more now. And the theme of that show, you talk about Rick Berman, the executive producer of the show. They thought, well, let's do this neat thing with this sort of popular music song with these great lyrics and this montage that shows the progress of humanity through some of the history we've actually experienced in space, and then taking it into the future, like the development of warp drive. And I thought it was brilliant. I still love that opening sequence. But you reported that Berman said they took a lot of heat for this from Trekkies.
Oh, they did. He got reamed by the Trekkies. Which I agree with you. I actually thought it worked, even at the time, thought it worked well. And nobody, few people are as fond of big orchestral opening theme songs as I am. I mean, I'm very much in that camp. But I thought it worked very well. But, Trekkies tend to be, fans of the series tend to be very traditional, and it was breaking with tradition. And, for whatever reason, they hated it. And, and there were actually, if they decided not to, there actually was a theme, an orchestral theme for it, because Dennis McCarthy, one of the main composers on it, who had done, all the way back to as the main composer on The Next Generation, knew he would be working the series, so he actually wrote a theme for it, an orchestral theme. It wasn't used as the opening theme, but it was used as the closing theme of Enterprise.
Yep. And
so, but yeah, Berman, I spoke to him about this, and it was funny because he just kept getting hate mail over this theme. And of course, that was also a theme. This was not written exclusively for Enterprise. It was actually the first time a female composer had written a theme song.
Diane Warren.
Diane Warren wrote it. Now, she wrote it prior to that. It was in Patch Adams, the film. But nevertheless, it was reused, repurposed for Enterprise.
And I thought it was very appropriate. We Trekkies, we can be a prickly bunch. I can't entirely leave Star Trek yet because another of my favorite soundtrack composers, David Newman, worked on what I still think is the greatest satire of Star Trek ever. And I go back to the original Mad Magazine Star Trek satire, Star Blech, Galaxy Quest, which is just the most entertaining film. It is such fun.
Yeah, no, I actually interviewed him twice because for some reason my computer crashed, and my first interview of him not only got rid of the original one, but somehow got rid of the backup. I don't know what happened. So it was kind of embarrassing to contact him again. Would you mind doing a second interview?
I've been there.
Yeah, no, it was good. But he was very enthusiastic about this film, of course, and when I mistakenly said it was a comedy, just in passing, he argued it wasn't. It was basically a love letter, which I agree with. It was both. With comedy and drama, and it was. And basically, at the beginning, he was given two options on what musical approach to use. Whether it would be more of the Goldsmith approach or the original film show approach. He picked the Goldsmith approach. And it put together a wonderful score. I thought it worked really well, a big orchestra. And the way they did it, because this was supposed to be, of course, an old television show like Star Trek, whereas an old television show wouldn't be able to afford a huge orchestra. So the theme song, they would do, for the main part of the film, you would have a full orchestra, but they would record it first with the big orchestra and then narrow it down to a smaller number of instruments, to start off with that for the television show. But then as the plot developed, it would explode into the full orchestra, the full cinematic. When they realize it's real, they go with the full orchestra. So it was interesting, just the way they're thinking about musically how to approach this, that the television would be a lot different than, a motion picture or reality. So
there's a scene there's so many scenes in that film that stick in my head. There's this scene where the ship is about to leave Stardock, and just like in the original Star Trek motion picture, this grand, inspiring soundtrack, and it starts to pull out, and the guy who's driving the ship, the pilot, who really doesn't know what he's doing, of course, because was a kid actor when he did it, it hits the side of Stardock and scrapes along the ship, leaves a big scrape mark. And it's just this great counterpoint to this wonderful music. It was just so great.
Yeah, no, kind of side note on David Newman. Of course, he was one of the great musical families in Hollywood.
Dynasties, yeah.
Yeah, an extraordinary dynasty. His father, Alfred Newman, one of the great classic golden age composers. And Alfred Newman wrote the 20th Century Fox fanfare. And so it's kind of had that connection to which of course Alfred Newman didn't know he'd have a connection to Star Wars, but it was just, she had an interesting history and how that all played out. But of course, David Newman, his brother, Thomas Newman, cousin with Randy Newman, and all the other Lionel Newman, I believe. Yeah. So.
Yep. And something you mentioned in the book that Kareem just brought up, that David Newman was a violinist in the orchestra for recording the soundtrack to Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So played violin in a lot of those different great film scores, with either Goldsmith or with Williams. James out there said, I always like the theme song to Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Great one. I love the Voyager theme. I remember telling some of the people involved with Trek that I just love the sort of searching across the galaxy theme that they came up with.
Yeah, Voyager was Goldsmith, but Deep Space Nine was Dennis McCarthy. We are at the top of the hour. I'm glad you got a few extra minutes. Please stick around, folks, if you can. But we got to get to that closing part of the book where you talk about the real music of space. We're the Planetary Society, so we have to talk about all of this. And it's already been mentioned by a couple of the people in chat. Maybe the most popular performance of music in space of all time, Chris Hadfield and Space Oddity, which you talk about in the book. Yeah, no, I had a good conversation with Chris Hadfield, and just the whole process of going through that. But yeah, I mean, the recording had hundreds of millions of views, and so he started brainstorming with his son about what he could do, what songs he could perform, how would he record it, and they came up with, I believe his son suggested Space Oddity. But of course, Chris Hadfield first saw, but the astronaut dies, and he didn't think that was a good message to send. And so they altered the lyrics, and they actually got permission from David Bowie to do that. And they started working out how they'd do it, how he'd actually, sing it within like in his sleeping quarters for the right acoustics, how they'd film it, in the various places on ISS, and using, they use GarageBand, yes, the software in space, and they came up, with that. But he also performed a lot of other things. But one of the more fascinating things was how it affected his voice. As we've all heard, I'm sure when you're in space, most people experience fluid shift. You feel like you have a head cold. And he mentioned that while his lower notes pretty much went away, his upper lighter notes, got stronger. So he thought that worked well for that particular song. But I was also kind of hearing all the physics, and I heard this also from Katie Coleman, who played the flute on ISS. The physics of playing when you're in weightlessness. You have to strap yourself in. Of course, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And when you're hitting a guitar, there's a lot of physics going on. That's an instrument that's designed for 1G, as pretty much every instrument that's ever been created was designed. Yeah. And so trying to compensate for the different physics in space, whether it be playing, how it impacts your voice, and other factors.
There's a line from the very near the end of the book that I will use that ties into what you've just talked about. But before we do that, before I get to that, it sounded like you, as I have, got the chance to talk to Anne Druyan, Carl Sagan, our co-founder's wife, but maybe just as important, if not more important, professional and creative partner, about the creation of the Voyager Golden Record, which now has that terrific collection of music headed out into interstellar space. Someday we'll get that message back. Send more Chuck Berry. But did you get to talk to Anne?
I did. It was a great conversation. And Chuck Berry came up, and there's some pushback on that as well. Of course, a lot of people were going for really serious music. I mean, they have plenty of serious music, but really fascinating process, trying just to figure out, because, limited space. Right now, if you're doing it now, and there are a number of groups who are trying to put together golden records like, recordings, but you don't have any restriction on space now, so to speak. But, with a record, she had to make very specific choices, had to really narrow it down, trying to be international, not just Western sounding music, making sure it was truly reflecting different cultures around the world, but also things that wasn't, in the Western culture, not necessarily just, Bach or other classical composers. So, I think they did a very good job with the small number of spaces they could possibly, memory, space on the record to use. I think they did a good job at, really finding a good balance.
Absolutely. I think they did an outstanding job considering that limitation. Albert mentions Hello from the Children of Planet Earth, which had its own sort of musical quality, those greetings from children all over the world. Here's that line, which really struck me and left me toward the end of the book. As more musicians, composers, artists, and ordinary people move beyond our home planet, the sound of space will no longer be defined by Hollywood, but by the people living, working, and performing in space. Do you have any doubt that as we become a spacefaring species, and maybe an interplanetary species, if not interstellar, that's going to change the face of not just music, but other arts?
Of course, it's, first off, music is part of this culture in space. Right now, there are, 2 guitars, and there have been for some time up on ISS, a keyboard. There have been lots of other instruments. Flute. Crews come together and play together, and that is part of that bonding ritual. And so it really is a key part. Or when the Inspiration 4 crew went up, they all created a playlist to bring up. Music played a big role. And so people will compose music, people will sing, but as more and more people go, music will be created in space, but it will be, because of the different environment and over time, different culture, different sounds will come. And just think about, when you're in these different environments, if you have different gravity, if you have different atmospheric pressure, how much will that impact the music, the sound? Will you create new instruments that work better in microgravity or in 1/3 gravity or in 1/6 gravity or whatever other gravities we encounter? So all these things will impact the music, the instruments, the performances, etc. So, I think they will over the next few centuries. I think they will certainly be, assuming that we can continue and humanity does truly move into space, music will come with us and it will be impacted by that. So there will be sounds that will only be, will be indigenous to Mars or the moon or somewhere else.
And I will bet you that when that colony is established on Mars someday, that they will still be watching and enjoying the soundtracks of Star Trek and Star Wars and Close Encounters and things to come, and so many of the other TV programs and movies that you cover in this great book, Chris. Thank you. You've made it sing.
Well, thank you very much. And as I said before, I hope the people who enjoy the book would write reviews on Amazon or elsewhere. That would be very helpful. Oh, and just not to plug one other thing, but since you mentioned the earlier book, Alcohol in Space, that should be the documentary version of that, should be appearing on Amazon this fall, and there will be I'll be announcing the official premiere in New York sometime soon. Hopefully this week, we'll be announcing the dates in October.
Congratulations. That's going to be great to watch. I have seen some of the footage, as you know, and it's just going to be great fun to hear the actual people who shared those stories with you of how they imbibed on orbit and maybe even elsewhere. Great fun. And you know what? I wanted to talk more about the women of space music, like the woman who wrote your foreword, Nami Melamed, because they're kind of underrepresented, aren't they?
They are. It's pretty much, film scoring has been a male-dominated field pretty much from the beginning. It's getting better. It still has a long way to go. I'm not sure the reason for it, but it's been very clear. And so, Nami and a number of other great composers out there are really pushing forward. And I think we've made a turned a corner here. I think now that it's expected, show producers and directors are expected to consider different options for film scores, not just the old boys club. So we'll see over the next few years, but I think Nami and a number of others are doing a wonderful job.
Chris, I think that Craig, who's watching us live, speaks for a lot of the folks who joined us, and certainly for me. I absolutely enjoyed your book, he says. Thank you. And I thank you as well, Chris, for a great conversation.
Well, thank you. Again.
The book, again, is right there. The music of, if I put it here, it's in focus. The Music of Space, Scoring the Cosmos in Film and Television by Chris Carberry. And it is available, if you haven't read it, in all the usual places. Now, time, if you'll bear with me, Chris, to mention our choices for September. And it is choices, plural, a little bit of a departure and a bit self-serving. Bear with us. Some of you members of the Planetary Society have probably already heard that we have a brand new series of books, 8 books, one for each planet of the solar system, by our own chief scientist, Dr. Bruce Betts. They are available right now from Learner Books. And if I can make this happen while I can talk and chew gum at the same time, I'm going to put a link up in the chat to the page on our website where you can read more about this series. Our guest at the end of September or the beginning of October to talk about all this will be Bruce Betts. And those of you who listen to Planetary Radio during the period those 20 years when I was hosting it, and Bruce continues on Planetary Radio with Sarah in the What's Up segment. You know that Bruce and I always had the best of times. So when we do our live discussion of this new series of books published in collaboration with the Planetary Society, and they are targeted at kids, but they're really fun for anybody. We're going to make it sort of an AMA, an Ask Me Anything. So if you have your questions about the solar system for the chief scientist, join us when we schedule that conversation with Bruce Betts. So that's something to look forward to, I hope. Again, you can find those books at Learner, L-E-R-N-E-R, learnerbooks.com, and all the other usual places, including Amazon. And you can read about the series at that URL that I put in the chat. Chris, I've kept you on long enough. Thanks again for all of this, and best of luck with the book, and especially with that new documentary, and Humans to Mars when it returns next spring, I hope.
Yeah, it is next spring. We'll announce the date soon, but it'll be actually now the first Humans to Moon and Mars Summit, H2M squared.
Excellent, excellent. I'd forgotten. That's going to be great, since we all hope that we will see humans returning to the moon pretty soon now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This will be available on our website and our YouTube channel, the recorded version of this conversation with Chris within a couple of days. Thanks for joining us. And one more time, Chris, thanks very much for spending the time with us and for this book.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Take care, everyone.